Hi, my name is Dallas Gingles. I'd like to begin by thanking Rick and Ken and John for putting together such an interesting conference and for allowing me to be a part of it, and I'd like to go ahead and get right to my paper. On the evening of January 28, 1919, Max Weber took the podium at a Munich bookstore to deliver a talk to a group of leftist students that would become the classic Politics as a Vocation. Weber was reluctant to give the lecture, not only because it took place in the middle of the political hothouse that marked the time between German surrender in November of 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919, but also because, as he saw it, the left-leaning student audience was without any sense of what political maturity in the present or foreseeable situation might be. He took it as his task then to disillusion them, because, as he told them, they would find neither easy answers nor favorable resolutions to the current crisis in which they found themselves. In the most famous section of Weber's talk, he contrasts an ethics of ultimate ends with an ethics of responsibility. To put it succinctly, responsibility defines the true vocation of the politician against alternatives driven by ideology or aspirations for moral purity. The ultimate end of ideology or moral purity makes politics impossible. Better, then, to be realistic about the enormous interdependencies, uncertainties, circularities, and conflicting stakeholders that constitute any politics, and to shoulder the burden of these so-called wicked elements in pursuit of some overarching goal. In an ethics of responsibility, the ultimate end is transposed into an overarching political goal. But at any point, that overarching goal can transpose back into an ideology, an ultimate end. This is roughly what Weber thought a demagogue represents, the politician who fronts as a responsible person in his blustering rhetoric about this or that overarching good of his particular political community, but who in fact has not a whit of the gravity that genuine politics both requires and engenders. The difference between an overarching political goal and an ultimate end is that the overarching political goal is always as defined by the adjective political as it is by the noun goal. The realities of politics frustrate the pursuits of goals, meaning that politics is the perpetual pursuit of an end we never truly reach. And if that sounds like a high modern account of tragedy, that's because it should. In quintessential Weberian fashion, the responsible politician is already at home in the world of disillusionment because he is a native of the world of disenchantment. The young people in the bookstore aren't ready to face the wicked problems of their day because they have yet to come to grips with the fact that politics is about the ongoing work of constructing proximate and penultimate solutions for wicked problems. That's difficult enough, but it's only the first step towards the disillusionment of responsibility. The genuinely responsible person knows, in an even more difficult second step, to expect that these proximate solutions are themselves the materials with which the next wicked problem will be constituted. Responsibility, then, is an ethics for a world of modern tragedy, disenchantment, and disillusionment, the world of wicked problems. In the nearly 100 years since Weber's lecture, responsibility has had an impressive history. Throughout the middle part of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr demanded that all Christian ethics be realistic and responsible, and this amounted in the first place to finding out what is really going on in any given situation by paying close attention to the hard facts of money and power. Niebuhr wound together this Weberian strand of thought with Christian theology. One of the most famous and influential of Niebuhr's texts is The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, a title borrowed from Jesus' parable about an unjust steward who uses his boss's money to earn political and corporate favors for himself. Niebuhr's responsibility praised those who, like the steward, were wise in their time, rather than unrealistically idealistic. Not because he refused to grant some transcendent good, though, whether in human nature, the horizon of humanity as a whole, morality itself, or even the ultimately transcendent good that is God. To the contrary, Niebuhr affirmed all of these in various ways at various times, and his entire system of moral thought, including the idea of responsibility, unravels without these different streams of transcendence. What Niebuhr did deny is that one is faithful to the transcendent by living as if one has already achieved or arrived at the transcendent. This, he warns, is an unrealistic and unfaithful way of interpreting humans, their history, and their relationship to God. It makes a mockery of both transcendence and immanence. And, in the long run, this unrealistic utopianism makes fools of both the dreamers and their dreams. Weber was less confident in these transcendent elements than was Niebuhr, but we can still hear Weber's voice in Niebuhr's version of responsibility. And to put my point in summary form, I want to argue that this responsibility ethics is the kind of approach we need to take when confronting the so-called super wicked problem of climate change. I know that I'm supposed to be imagining a future where the carbon has sunk and the wind farms have yielded their crops, something akin to Reagan's Morning Again in America for environmentalism, and then to retrofit solutions from that imagined dawn back to our own time. But in order to even suggest anything as concrete as that, I want to ask us to look back instead, to imagine ourselves sitting in that bookstore as Weber talks, or if you like, in Niebuhr's Christian ethics class at Union Seminary in the 40s. We need to be put through the exercises of disillusionment if we are to heft onto our shoulders the burdens of responsibility. And the first lesson, I think, is simply that we need to learn to be disillusioned well. This has the ironic benefit of encouraging us to action in the face of overwhelming problems. Why act if your goals will inevitably be frustrated? Activists are familiar with this kind of question. In the face of mind-boggling problems, they stir people to action from previous states of inertia. You do it because it matters, they say, or because it's the right thing to do, or because it matters to the starfish you do throw back into the ocean, or because it's simply better than doing nothing at all. Anticipating disillusionment by being thoroughly disenchanted is an odd kind of enchantment. It makes it possible to act in the face of seemingly overwhelming situations. But that kind of action easily slides into utopianism and to moral posturing. I moved into a sustainable farming commune. The least you can do is change the light bulbs in your lamps. The bigger lesson here is, I think, that anticipating disillusionment, knowing that our goals will always be frustrated, frees us not just to act in the face of overwhelming problems, but to act in ways that are unexpected and with unlikely partners. Here, the particularities of Niebuhr's theological account of responsibility are helpful. For Niebuhr, unlike Weber, history and historical actions are genuinely held in the care of providence. Every historical act is equidistant from eternity, as he put it in The Nature and Destiny of Man. By placing all actions under the promise of God's providential care and judgment, Niebuhr levels the moral playing field without surrendering morality itself to the glib mistake of equivalency. It isn't false moral equivalency that allows us to act in unexpected ways with unlikely partners, to dirty our hands with responsible actions that are inevitably morally ambivalent, if not morally suspect. It is confidence in God's care and belief in God's forgiving grace. This is why we are free, in the words of the parable, to make for ourselves friends of unrighteous mammon. We work as children of darkness, with children of darkness, because children of darkness are more shrewd than the children of light. It's another responsibility ethicist, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who captures this idea more poignantly than Niebuhr. Reflecting on the conditions surrounding his participation in the conspiracy against the Nazi regime, Bonhoeffer writes that when undertaking what he calls a free venture of responsibility, the Christian surrenders these acts to the God who looks upon the heart, weighs the deeds, and guides history. And this brings me to the issue of climate change. Along with a number of other environmental thinkers and activists, Bill McKibben has argued that the size of the climate change problem is so large that it will require large-scale coordination that we've only seen one other time in human history, the American mobilization for World War II. David Roberts at Vox has offered a generous but pointed criticism of McKibben on this point. Roberts writes, McKibben tells the story of his travails at Democratic platform meetings as though they carry deep lessons, but I don't think they do. The Democratic platform, to put it bluntly, doesn't matter. No revolutionary mobilization of the sort McKibben describes is possible without sweeping legislation. No sweeping legislation is possible without GOP cooperation, and no GOP cooperation seems possible. That, not the machinations of the Democratic Party elite, is the nut of the political problem. So, to stick with the image of World War II, The point is that if you anticipate that you won't get a total surrender in the climate war because the problem is as super wicked as we think it is, you can feel free to leverage power for any victory whatsoever. If you don't expect to win a total victory, there's no reason to enforce party loyalty or purity tests. And in fact, to achieve even a modicum of success in a fight like climate change as McKibben describes it, we must work with enemies and traitors as much as with allies and heroes. The disillusionment Weber teaches, and the theological framing Niebuhr supplies, suggest that anticipating that GOP non-cooperation will frustrate efforts to bring about meaningful climate change legislation ironically frees us to double down on engaging them to do whatever we can for the climate, rather than it does giving us permission to ignore them. And this brings me close to something like a concrete proposal, which isn't quite retrofitted from the glorious morning of 2050, but rather from the gloom of that German evening in 1919, and also a bit closer to home for me. If Roberts is right that achieving any meaningful climate reform will require substantial movement in the GOP, environmental activists will have to make friends for themselves of unrighteous mammon, friends like the gun lobby. I'm from rural East Texas. I grew up with guns, I grew up hunting, and I still like to hunt, though I rarely have the opportunity anymore. No one in the United States has a more immediate emotional connection to protecting the environment than people like my family. But almost to a person, rural white gun owners and hunters are deeply opposed to any government interference in almost anything and have been taught to loathe the EPA. In a zero-sum game between environmental lefties and the NRA, my uncle knows which side he's unholstering for. I think the NRA is a fairly evil organization, and partnering with them is a morally suspect business. But I also think the NRA has a lot of power with people who have an immediate, deep, and intergenerational emotional attachment to fields and streams. And it has been more successful at achieving its ends than most environmental groups have been at achieving theirs. If this constituency of hunters could be leveraged for meaningful environmental policy reform, that would do more than almost anything else to force Congress into action. If you turned hunters into environmentalists, you would radically shift the leverage points in the Republican Party itself. You might not change their stance on gun control, nor on issues of sexuality, the death penalty, or the tax code, and your hands might feel covered in mud from these and other points of moral and political dirtiness. But you would have an entire Congress incentivized to pass meaningful environmental legislation. Put simply, Niebuhrian responsibility, undergirded with Weberian disillusionment, suggests that rather than working to invigorate its base, climate change activists should make for themselves friends of unrighteous mammon by partnering with morally suspect groups to reach unlikely future partners like recalcitrant rural hunters. This may seem unrealistic, but it's certainly no less daunting than the actual problem of globally reversing trends in carbon emissions. And viewed through a certain lens, it seems much more realistic than many other options. As I've already mentioned, responsibility requires the ongoing work of peering into the hard facts of a situation and working within the limitations of any particular situation. As such, it isn't ethics for the politician. But in order to bring about large-scale political action, calculations of rationality won't get you very far. People are moved by emotion. Thus the appeal of Weber's demagogue, who offers the simplistic bluster of final solutions to deeply complex problems. That bluster is more moving than the complex, disillusioned penultimate solutions on offer from a real politician who makes no promises about making all of your problems disappear once for all. A bit ironically, though, these emotions are one of the hard facts that makes any realistic politics must take into account, which is another point that environmental thinkers have already noted. Again, borrowing from Roberts, it's difficult, if not impossible, to secure the emotional buy-in necessary for any large-scale action without some outsized Manichaean embodiment of evil like Hitler. In the case of climate change, rather than construct an external evil by which to lure emotional reaction, billing the climate problem in terms of a blitzkrieg on human existence, it would be smarter to trade on the already latent emotional purchase that the land has on rural hunters. And this tracks with the highly successful politics of aggrievement that we see motivating the average Trump supporter. Climate change is a more real, direct, and immediate threat on our way of life than any of the trade deals or ethnic groups that have functioned as scapegoats in this election cycle. If it's part of the wisdom of the children of darkness to capitalize on the natural affections of rural peoples by portraying the objects of their affections as under threat, it makes good sense to borrow from that wisdom by showing how the woods and fields and rivers and lakes they truly love are under genuine threat. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that trying to transform hunters into environmental activists would bring about a total victory by 2050. As I've said, I don't believe there's a total victory to be had. And moreover, these same lessons of responsibility suggest one last point. If we work within morally ambivalent situations with morally suspect partners, we might achieve some success. But let us imagine that we had success on an unpredictable and magical scale, such that tomorrow morning the entire NRA voting bloc woke up as rabid environmentalists. We would be no closer to winning that mythical total victory in the climate war. We would still need to remain vigilantly responsible, as disillusioned as we are today. And in this case, that would be for a very good reason. Even if the United States went carbon neutral tomorrow, there's no guarantee that other nations would follow suit. Nor is there even any decent reason to be hopeful that they would. This is another well-rehearsed point in the literature. Developing economies protest that we got rich from the environmental revolution, not to mention the export and exploitation of their natural goods and colonization, and that it should be their turn. Even if we solve some of those complaints, the so-called BRIC nations show no sign of choosing lower emissions over lower GDP. In the long run, if any country or any alliance of political actors, like the EU for instance, is going to make a meaningful impact, it will require enforcing global agreements in the face of national intransigence. This means, again, in Niebuhrian terms, taking into account all the factors of the situation, especially money and power, and in this case, hard power. To put it bluntly, this would mean the possibility of defending the environment with military force. I'm not at all confident in the morality of this option, and it's certainly not obvious that anything approaching this kind of hard power intervention would be a justified war. If anything, it would be a dangerous deconstruction of just war reasoning, more in the arena of a holy war than the arena of a modern conflict intelligible within the discourses of sovereign states and international law. This means that, as both Weber and Niebuhr would have believed, we should expect as much or more frustration at the global level as the local. And like the NRA and hunters, we should look for unlikely partnerships, identifying the levers of power that might force intractable global actors to comply with new norms of, for instance, limits on carbon production. Or, to put it more simply, part of responsible action is the willingness to force other political actors into taking responsibility for their actions. And this includes pushing them to learn the disillusionment that frees them to undertake unpopular and undesirable courses of action with their constituencies. And this brings us back to that cold night of 1919. If we are to reach the morning again in 2050, it will almost certainly be because we went from being Weber's students in disillusionment to becoming local and global tutors in responsibility. Thank you.